Welcome to Crotty's Bakery Malaysia. My name is Donald Crotty, and today I'd like to share with you some tips and secrets on the making of scones. And why scones? Well, a lot of you as friends, customers, followers have been asking me over a period of time would I share my secrets because you actually enjoy eating my scones. But just to understand, scones are a very personal thing. And even in the name scone, the derivative and where it comes from and the context of scone. So what is a scone in a stone versus scone, gone? Well, actually it's the same thing. It just is based on a regional or national way of doing things. So a company called YouGov a number of years ago did an actual survey in the UK and Ireland, and to share with you details of that survey, in the UK it was found that over 55% of people in the UK did the pronunciation as scone as in gone. Whereas when the same survey was actually taken in Ireland, the outcome was somewhat different, where it was over 70% of people recognised the word as scone as in stone. So being Irish and being used to it, from here on in I'll be referring to it as a scone. But it doesn't matter, it's all about the beauty and the wonder of this gorgeous cake. And so now let's get baking. So anyway, when we're talking about scones, it's really, really important to understand that there are some basic techniques involved in the baking of scones, and that technique makes a difference whether you're having a scone which is an edible scone or inedible. Have you ever been in a cafe, really look forward to having your scone, and then you actually get it and you go to try and break it open and it's like a rock? Or alternately, you're able to break it open, but when you start eating it, it starts to stick in your mouth like glue. Well, obviously, those kind of scones, they may look good, but they're not the scone that people want. I mean, in fact, really good scones are a little bit ugly. They're not imperfect because they're perfect in how they affect your taste. Anyway, to make those scones, basically there are 5 tips and techniques that I'm going to share with you today. And the first of those tips is based around one of the fundamental ingredient, which is flour. So here I have 450 grams of flour. However, it's a low protein flour. Normally people would recommend that when you're actually baking with scones, you will actually use self-raising flour. So what I do is I convert what is a low protein, and being low protein means low gluten. Low gluten basically means a little bit less structure and a softness which you won't get from a high protein flour. And the other part is never ever use a cake flour, because cake flour typically has a form of cornstarch in it which softens the whole thing in terms of making this gluey thing inside in your mouth. So what I start with is 450 grams of flour, and this flour I have sieved 2 or 3 times to just lighten it up, and put in the basic baking powder. And the baking powder combination to make it self-raising is 2 teaspoons of baking powder per 150 grams. So in here already I have 6 teaspoons of baking powder, okay? And that makes my self-raising flour, and it's now the right type of flour. In terms of other ingredients that we're going to be using, here basically I have some salt and baking powder. You say baking powder, but you've already put it in. But now I'm actually creating self-raising and adding some additional baking powder and salt to it. Then, in addition to that, I'm going to have eggs, which are a very important constituent ingredient, and I'll explain later. And then, depending on whether you're making a savory scone or a sweet scone, in this case, I'm going to make a sweet scone. So, inside here, we have some sugar, not too much, try and keep it down. But as I said, you can have no sugar, and in that case, it would be a savory scone. But I'm going to basically divide my mix into 2. And one part will be sultanas and the other part will be cranberries. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on that later. So the first thing and most important technique in actually making the scone is in combining together the flour and the fat. And like any pastry, this is what creates that perfection, and it's like gluing this together which actually creates your pastry. For me, I'm one of those people who's unfortunately hot-handed. So they say to be a great pastry chef, you need to have cold hands. I don't have cold hands. So what I need to do instead, and I use a compensation, is that I will use frozen butter. So I put the butter in the freezer before I use it, and I would pre-weigh it here. So I'll take it out of the freezer. And here's our solid frozen butter. And what I do is I actually take a grater, and I put this in, actually, before that I do that. Let's put in our salt and baking powder, and make sure I get all of that in. And then we're going to mix this together. So what you want to make now basically is you want to make your scone crumbs, like breadcrumbs. So we grate it first. And while I'm grating, so where did scones come from? And obviously, you know, being Irish, we would claim that it's definitely from Ireland, and the Scots will claim it's from Scotland, and the English will claim it's from England, and I guess it doesn't really matter, but the first reference to an actual scone is in the early 15th century, in 1513, in Scotland, in a Scottish document. So in that sense, I have to give it up and say it must be to do with Scotland. And in terms of the actual name itself, which is interesting, where does the derivative of the name scone? Well, there are many different Gaelic expressions and words which could be associated, but actually the Oxford English Dictionary says the derivation came from a Dutch and a German word. And basically, let me get it right, the Dutch word is schoenbrot, and the German word is skonbrot, and both of them mean something like fine or beautiful bread, which it actually is. So there you are. We'll take it from Scotland or Ireland, and the reality of the basis of the bread is that it actually comes from, the name comes from the Netherlands and from Germany. So we take this out, and then we basically clear all of our frozen butter out. Okay. Perfect. And now what we're going to do is we're going to make those scone crumbs. And how you do that basically is just literally very lightly working with the butter and working with the flour. Okay. Now, oops. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave you now, and I'll come back to you when it's done, and I'll show you what they actually look like. So here we are again, and now look at this. See? It's actually falling through, and that's part of the kind of just lift it just gently like that. So the combining it literally is just patience, not too much finger contact. So when you're actually doing it, just be patient and let it like run through your fingers, and then eventually you have these beautiful little crumbs here. So that gives us our dry ingredient. And then in this case, as I said to you earlier, we're going to make a kind of a sweeter scone, so I'll add a little bit of sugar to it. Okay, oh, there we are. Now, blend that up together. Perfect. So gorgeous. Now, this is really, really important, and it's the third tip that I'm going to give you, is basically you have everything prepared. Because within this, as you said, you have your baking powder, and that's your active leavening agent. Once you put liquid in with your leavening agent, then it starts to activate. So once it activates, basically, it only has life, call it, for a limited time. So what you want to do is you want to kind of keep that time between the time you put the liquid in and the time you actually prep and get in the oven as short as possible. Now, there are some who might actually suggest when you get this out on your rack, that what you actually do is, and you got everything cut out, you put it in the fridge for about 15 minutes. And the idea there basically is to retard the pastry, because it is a form of pastry, so it's retarding the pastry. So then when it goes into the oven, it literally enlivens and blows up and explodes like a thunderstorm or lightning. And that's why, in fact, often like your scones are a little bit ugly when they come out, because they do explode, literally. If you watch, it's a gorgeous thing to watch a scone being baked. Anyway, so back to the thing, having everything prepared. So what does everything prepared mean? You have your dry ingredients, and then you're going to be adding basically some milk, buttermilk and egg, and in this case, and in a lot of cases, people can't get buttermilk. So what we do is we add a little drop of vinegar into full milk, and we basically give that a little bit of whir around, and then if we leave it there for a few seconds, it starts to become what is equivalent to buttermilk. And one of the key elements within buttermilk is the acid. And that's where again, the vinegar, the acetic acid, provides that, which again helps the leavening, helps the rising of the scone. And then what we're going to be doing basically is we add 2 eggs into 450. So and this is another important technique. So when you're actually beating the eggs, you see here, it's stuck. So you beat it enough so that what they call the eggs run through the fork. Now, see that? Just literally runs through the fork. And what we do is we add that now to our milk. Some people put it in separately, but for me, I like to do the two together. So now I have my liquid. Still haven't added it. But because I'm going to be dividing my scones into two here, so what I do basically is that I'll weigh it out. So let's do this quickly. Right, we have 660, so 330 grams then basically for each. So I'll weigh this one here and weigh out 330 grams. Okay. So now we have our 330 grams, and what I'm going to do is pull it together, and we'll add this one with our sultanas. So first of all, just mix it up well. Now, always put in a generous portion of sultanas when you're making it. There's nothing worse than actually getting a scone, which is called a fruit scone, and you actually break it open and there's one solitary sultana sitting in the middle of it. And too often, in order to save cost, places will do that. Whereas a sultana scone is quite different than a plain scone. If I want a plain scone, I'll have a plain scone. So anyway, we make this basically here. And so I'm going to add, for me, I mean, I just do it by feel. And this is also important. When you're actually combining it, be patient, because the liquid slowly starts to activate with the crumbs. And if you try and put in too much liquid and it seems like, oh, there's a lot of kind of crumbs there and it doesn't seem to be combining, if you do it too quickly, then you can end up with a very wet and soggy dough. So, now, how you often get a feel is when you use your finger and you get a sense then of how actually wet it is. I'm going to add a small drop more. So you don't add more until you're pretty sure of whether you've got the consistency as you would want it to be. I'm happy with this. This is looking good. It's combining very nicely. Yeah, nice and soft. So what we're going to do now is we're going to basically flour the surface. I'm going to bring it out and combine it together, okay? Let's get a bit of flour here. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to take that out here. Okay, now we have it out of the bowl, and we take our extra bit out of there. You see it's a nice gluey consistency. Okay, now there are again many different techniques of what people actually do at this point in terms of how they combine, and some people will actually use a rolling pin and roll it out, but for me I prefer to kind of keep it the consistency and to keep it as, like with all pastry, the less you play around with the pastry, the better the quality will be and the softer it will be. So for me, that's combined good. Now, in terms of size that you actually use, for the business here, I use two different sizes. So I use a 4.5 centimeter and a 5.5 centimeter cutter, but some people prefer in a 6.5 meters. So this is a 5.5 and this is the 4.5, and this would be the larger 6.5, but as I said, I use this one here. So what I do now is I have my thing ready, okay? So my sheet again is ready so that I keep moving. Okay, so we keep going basically until we have each. Now this one here is half of the thing, so normally this would be to make 6 scones, okay? Now, 5, let me take it 6. Again, keeping the height. For me, I like higher, some people like them flatter. It just depends on, again, what your preference is in terms of how you like your scones. So, we'll basically be able to get 7, and then we'll be able to get a little one, but we'll put that aside for later. Okay, now we just basically will do the same with our cranberry, and then I'll come back to you when we've them all ready and ready to put in the oven. So welcome back, and now just this, the last one of the cranberry. The scones that I was kind of doing. So now what we've got out of that, 450 grams of flour, we've got 3, 6, 9, 12, 13 and a little bit, a small one, like so just do a small one at the end. Next thing we want to do, and said again, don't waste too much time talking because we need to make sure to try and get these things in the oven quickly. So what we do now basically is, and I'm going to push it over so that you actually get to see it. There we are. Okay, so here's where I have them. And I'm using basically the mixture that I had earlier with the milk and the egg, which is an egg wash in the form. And this will give it a nice golden color on top. And when it's mixed with, and that's why I like to turn the scones over the way they are, because when it's actually mixed with the flour from the base of the scone, as it would have been when I was kind of rolling out or pushing out the pastry. So, now, as you can see, I'm not being terribly particular in terms of like, are the shapes perfect? It doesn't matter. In fact, my belief is an ugly scone is a beautiful scone, because sometimes ugly things can actually taste way better than those that are perfectly refined. There's our last, so just 2 more, and then we're going to pop these in the oven. And we're putting them in at 190 degrees. That's what I like, to put in 190 degrees, and never for longer than 15 minutes. It's really, really important that you don't have your scones going into the oven for over 15 minutes. What people often do is they're waiting for their scones to brown, and they leave them in that extra length of time, and then what you end up with is this dry scone, this rock type scone. So it's better to have it just a slight goldeny coming on top, but you'll see it if you actually watch a scone baking, which is worthwhile. It's actually a very interesting exercise to do. So now I'm going to put them in for roughly 14.5 minutes, and we will then come back to you when they're baked, okay? So now we've had our scones in for a little over 14 minutes, 14 minutes, 10, 20 seconds. I'm going to take them out of the oven. And if you can see them here, a beautiful golden color. And the 5th tip basically is when you take them out of the oven is that you leave them on the actual baking tray that you have them on for about 5 minutes. And the reason being is that the actual base will continue to cook a little bit. So instead of having a white base, which mine have like now, kind of a whitish base, they'll have a browner base on them. But anyway, these are perfectly cooked. You can see perfectly lifted. Now, as they say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So although these are hot, and you shouldn't do this because the normal practice is that you wait for 5 minutes, put them on a rack tray, and after the rack tray, then just give them time to cool down a little bit. But anyway, I just want to give you a sense of what they look like. So as you can see, I've got a mixture of like beautiful and ugly ones here. And I'm going to take one of the kind of ugly ones, see the way it's split and thing. And this is the other tip with the scone, is that rather than cutting it with a knife, use the scone itself, break it open. Now look at that. It's absolutely, just perfect. So what I want to do now, basically, is I want to put a little bit of butter and jam, and I have a cup of tea here as well. But first of all, I'm going to run through the 5 tips again. So the first tip was getting the flour right, okay? So that you pick the low protein flour and make it self-raising yourself. Sieve it a couple of times before you do anything with it. The second tip is with the butter, and that is to freeze the butter so it's easy for you to grate it in, and then using your hands and manipulate just very gently, not too much hands as in pressing down, but actually doing, there's our, yes, that was our alarm going off to say that we were done. We're actually done about 25 seconds or 30 seconds before. So then the third tip is like, don't combine the ingredients, put the wet with the dry until after you're ready and have everything prepared. So because you want to reduce the time it takes to get the dough together, to cut the dough out and get it in the oven is kind of key. Then basically in terms of temperature, about 190 degrees, 185, 190 degrees with fan, and only for about 14 minutes. And you can have a look inside, because what you're looking for is that golden color literally only comes in the last minute, minute and a half. And it's when that golden color is coming, get them out. Don't leave them in too long so that they don't dry out. And then the final tip in terms of getting the bases of them done is that when you take them out, leave them on the baking tray for about 5 minutes before you transfer to the rack. So now I'm going to actually enjoy, even though it's a little bit hot, I'm going to put this, because I'm Irish, you know, none of this kind of clotted cream stuff. Basically have basic butter, and I will be a bit thing here because I'm actually going to put some black cherry jam. And gosh, oh, that's gorgeous, if I may say so myself. Anyway, I wish you all your good luck in making your scones, and I look forward to seeing you again on our next episode, which will cover actually this one over here, a very, very famous Irish product called the brown soda. So check in again in a month or so. Thank you.